Welcome you to A.Connector, and today we
Good
want
to
to
be
talk.
here.
You're welcome. Thank you. And we want to talk to you about some of your vast knowledge on the subject of indigenous peoples in Taiwan. So, where are we going, Cheryl?
Where was I going?
Where are we going?
Where are we going?
Yeah.
I don't know. We can go anywhere in Taiwan because there are indigenous people all over the island.
Okay.
And people might, if people aren't familiar with Taiwan, they might not know that Taiwan has an indigenous population, or that there are indigenous people, just as I said, almost everywhere around Taiwan. A lot of people, even Taiwanese, are really shocked when they find out that although they know that there are 16 officially recognized tribes, there are hundreds and hundreds of indigenous communities all around Taiwan, from the high mountains to the coast. And most of them are quite accessible in Taiwan. Long time ago, many indigenous groups lived high in the mountains, definitely without paved roads or things like that. But over the course of time, either through the need to be near schools and medical facilities, or being forced, first by the Japanese, when they occupied Taiwan from 1895 to 1945, and then later by the Kuomintang government, they were forced down from higher elevations now to much lower elevations. Mm-hmm. This makes getting to know indigenous culture in Taiwan very easy.
Right. Let me just interject something for context, Cheryl. Cheryl mentioned something. Originally, most Aborigines, many of them lived in high elevation up in the mountains. And that, in fact, the term for Aborigine people that was used and is now fortunately out of fashion because the Aboriginal people didn't really like it. They were called mountain people. And probably because of that association.
So now it's not considered PC. Yes.
Right. Yeah, just like in America, Indians are more correctly referred to as Native Americans. So now we refer to people here as Aboriginal or indigenous peoples.
Yes.
Okay.
So, yes, that's true. And so, but now there's actually one community that is quite interesting. In Chinese, its name is Gaoshan, which means high mountain. Mm-hmm. It's actually not in a mountain. In the only community of the Bunun tribe that is actually right along the Pacific coast.
Okay, and whereabouts? Which county?
Hualien.
Oh, in Hualien County. Okay.
And it's very interesting. The community is so named because they were once up in the high mountains. So it refers to where they once were, rather than where they are now. So that's why you get some interesting community names like that.
Right.
So that may not actually describe their current situation.
Okay. While you're talking, I'm just pulling up a map that I'm going to share in a second, just show where Hualien County is, because obviously some people don't know. Let me see if I can get that.
Hualien County and Taidong County, also along eastern Taiwan, they have relatively larger proportions of indigenous populations. Over the entire island of Taiwan, indigenous people make up about 2% of the population.
Right.
And but in Hualien County, they make up about a fourth, 25%.
Okay.
And then when you get down to Taidong County, farther south, then we're already to about 30%, a third of the population. And there's also quite a lot of diversity along eastern Taiwan. So we're talking about Hualien having 6 of the 16 officially recognized tribes, and then when you get down to Taidong, it's 7. So these are very good areas if you want to explore communities of different tribes in a short amount of time.
Well, I've got the pointer on the Hualien map. Why don't you list the indigenous tribes that are located in Hualien?
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can remember them all. The largest one in Taiwan, and therefore the largest one in Hualien Taidong, is the Amis tribe. Mm-hmm. And then we have the Bunun that I just mentioned.
Okay.
and also the Turuku tribe, or sometimes called the Turoko tribe.
Right.
So some people might have heard of Turoko Gorge.
Right. I'm showing that right here.
Yeah, which is a very famous destination, tourist
Mhm.
destination in Taiwan, and that was named for this particular tribe, the Turoko tribe. You also have the Sakazaya, or in Chinese called Sachilaya, and the Gamelan. And farther south, you also have, if we go to Orchid Island, you have the Dao, or Yami tribe. And then you also have some people from the Saijek tribe as
And
well.
where would that be?
Back up in Hualien.
Back up in Hualien. Now,
or
are most of those
yeah.
people down kind of like in the plains, or would they be more up in the mountains, or kind of
Well, the
split?
Amis, it's along the coast is mostly the Amis people.
Okay.
That particular community, Gaoshan, that was a little bit the exception.
Mhm.
That is a Bunun community along the coast. That's very, very rare in Taiwan. Most Bunun communities are still in the mountains, not as high mostly as they used to be, but still fairly high in the mountains compared to many of the other tribes. And I should also mention, a lot of people, when they come to Taiwan for the first time, actually are quite surprised about Taiwan's mountains.
Right.
So Taiwan is mostly covered in mountains. It's about 2/3
Mhm.
mountain. And the highest mountains get up to around almost 4,000 meters, right?
Right.
Jade Mountain. And you have many over 3,000 meters in height. And many of those are cutting the island vertically in half, so that much of the population is on the western side, the side that's facing towards China, as you
Right.
show on.
Over here where we are
and
in
so
Taichung City, right here. This is the
Yes.
western side.
And so then, because the mountains cutting the island almost in half vertically, logistically, it makes it more difficult to get between the west and the east. So the east definitely is not as developed as the
Mhm.
west. And there's a much smaller population on the East Coast. So a lot more of the nature has been preserved there, as well as the culture.
Mhm.
And so I often get that when I often ask people what most surprises them about coming to Taiwan for the first time, the answer is always that they're very surprised that Taiwan has mountains.
Right.
And that Taiwan has so many mountains and so many high mountains. Okay, so so with that said, going back to that question, along the coast, it is mostly the Amis. The Amis also live in some of the hills. There, along the coast, there's the coastal mountain range. And then, as I mentioned, that going down the center of the island vertically is the very high central mountain range. So there's a part of eastern Taiwan that's called the East Rift Valley, and it's between these two mountain ranges. And so that in that East Rift Valley, you have a lot of hills and mountains. So you would generally find the Bunong there.
I see.
Along the coast, especially in Hualien, you'll also find the Gamelan and the Sakazaya. These were originally what were called Pingpu, or Plains Indigenous peoples.
Mhm.
It's apparently becoming a very non-PC thing as well.
Right.
That
Right.
these people just want to be called Indigenous people along with the rest of them, and feel.
Well, I should add for the lowland Aboriginal people, I think that's part of the thing. I think the real thing is it's beyond that. They want to be recognized as a tribal entity, and they want the benefits that go along with having that official recognition. And
they don't want to be separated like that. But these are the only two of those lowlands groups that have been able to achieve official recognition, because achieving official recognition is not an easy thing. You have to prove that your language is still being spoken. There must be people who speak it fluently. And you must have a good idea of what your traditional lands, traditional boundaries were. You have to be to reclaim your traditional clothing and your traditional ceremonies. So it is quite a very difficult process, especially many of the lowland groups. They had much more interaction with the dominant Han Chinese group that is in Taiwan society
Right.
much further on. And so they experienced a lot more cultural and language loss earlier on as well. So that's somewhat difficult. There is another group down in Tainan, which is in southern Taiwan on the western side. And they're called the Shilaya, and they have been very hard to achieve official recognition. They've done so at the city level, but not yet at the central government level. One of the big issues there is language. About 10, 12 years ago, I was working on my first book, which is called The Real Taiwan in the Dutch. And I was working on it with the Dutch representative to Taiwan at that time, Mr. Goodhart. And when the Dutch occupied Taiwan, and this was in the 17th century, they had quite a lot of contact with the Shilaya who were living in the Tainan area and still are. Part of the group that came over from Holland were missionaries. And it was found that they had actually translated parts of the Bible into their language. Taiwan's indigenous groups traditionally had no written text. So the languages, in order to have a written text now, have been Romanized. And so these Dutch missionaries in the 17th century, created these Bible versions using Romanized forms of the Shilaya language. And that is what the Shilaya have used to create a dictionary of their language and working hard to teach people so that there can be people who may be able to be fluent in the Shilaya language. And that would go a long way in getting them recognition at the central government level.
And which area in Tainan County are the Shilaya? Are they from kind of somewhere like around here? Was it Guantien or
Mado would probably be more of their
oh, really?
District would be more of their northern part, and then they go down all the way to they cover quite a large part of what was originally known as Tainan County, but has now been incorporated into Tainan City.
Right. Okay. Before I forget, you mentioned the Bunong people. Am I wrong in my observation that they tend to be darker skinned, many of them?
Well, it's not only the Bunun, and there's been a lot of intermarriage. So it's hard to say that you can make such a generalization now. I think indigenous groups, it's just not possible now. Just
because there's been so much
intermarriage,
the diaspora. Because kind of the feeling I got was like I have some Bunong friends, and I must want to say that kind of a little bit similar to like the Australian indigenous people. I mean, not exactly, but kind of a little bit more of that kind of a look.
I don't know that they look so similar to the Australian indigenous people, but they tend, conventionally they've been thought of as being, a bit shorter than.
Okay, right. That I definitely noticed.
So but again, it's not everybody now.
Right.
So
right.
Because there's been so much intermarriage and mixing of genes and.
Yep. Just like everywhere, just like in America, just like everywhere. Yep.
So now, you can see some indigenous people. Like, I remember one of the funniest experiences I had was the very first time I went to visit an indigenous community in Alishan. I was like, why are there so many foreigners here? But they weren't foreigners. They were actually the indigenous Zo. Because many, going back again to that Dutch occupation, there was a lot of interaction with the Dutch as well, and the Zo. And so it's thought that at least 2 clans there have Dutch DNA.
Right.
So some of their faces really look very European. And so that was one thing that kind of struck me on my first visit to the Zoe community. So you can really see really different kinds of looks, but
Right.
actually because of intermarriage now, people can be indigenous and look very Han Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
And so, vice versa, I
Right.
guess.
Right.
Because actually Taiwan can be considered an indigenous nation, because it's thought that at least 60 to 70% of Taiwanese have some indigenous blood.
Right.
Because, when the first wave of Han Chinese immigrants came, right after the Dutch left, some 400 years ago, it was only the men who came. And so they ended up, fraternizing with the local indigenous women. And
Fraternizing. Yeah.
if you know what I mean.
Yeah. That's one adjective.
So
Begins with F too, right?
yes. So I can't really say that they married, but they
Right.
fraternized.
Yeah.
The local indigenous women, and so many of the children born at that time were a mix of Han Chinese and
Right.
Taiwan indigenous.
Have you ever heard the Chinese saying "唐山只有阿公，只有阿公没有阿嬷"?
Yes,
Yeah.
right. That time women weren't allowed to come over, it was only the men.
Right.
And so you had all these men and they needed female companionship.
Right.
So so therefore
I think history proves that out time and time again, that men are always looking for female companionship, and lo and behold, thousands and thousands of years later, we still have people roaming this earth. So
that's right.
Yeah.
So but anyway, so that's and a lot of people will tell you in Taiwan that they think they have indigenous blood because they think from their appearance or from their grandmother's appearance,
Right.
or from what they've heard from what their family members have told them. So it could be actually quite a large proportion of the population here in Taiwan. Is not just 2%. It could be much, much, much larger than that.
Right. Yeah, like I know in my wife's family case, because it's funny, like my son, a lot of times when he was younger, people would hear him speak and they know he's native, but they look at him and he doesn't really look like pure, the classic Han kind of look, so they would assume that maybe he's Aboriginal or indigenous. And in fact, my wife later on told me that they're pretty sure that grandma was an indigenous woman, and married grandpa, who was pure Minnan, from Fujian, a few generations back. So yeah, and I've seen a lot of people. I've seen a lot of people here that clearly they have Aboriginal features, and you mentioned that a lot of them are just kind of like, no, I'm Taiwanese, I'm Chinese, but a lot of them don't know, and we should mention, because there was kind of a stigma, just like in America, where a lot of indigenous peoples were not treated very well and were not made to feel maybe even a part of society. And so therefore they kind of, shied away from it. So, but I think that might be changing, where people now, it's like, hey, we're embracing Taiwan as multicultural, it's diverse. And so, yeah, okay, quite possibly that great grandma or grandma was part Atayal or part, Bunong or whatever.
Well, going back 15 or 20 years ago, I remember during the Chen Shui-bian administration that actually being indigenous became cool.
Right.
Well,
it's definitely Taiwanese.
But I mean, maybe that coolness has worn off a bit, but it still is that I think that was it brought many indigenous people who were hiding their identity out a bit more into willing to go out a little bit more into the spotlight and maybe reclaim their indigenous name. At that time, it was possible you didn't have to keep using the Chinese name that you were given. You could actually go back to using your indigenous name.
Right. I think the DPP has the DPP. I know has one high level woman that I think uses her Aboriginal name.
The spokesperson.
Right. So, which is fine. I mean, why not? It's your name.
Yeah, and being able to to actually spell that out in romanization rather than Chinese characters.
Right.
So
Right.
that became very different. So a lot of people said, maybe it is time to reclaim my identity and not be ashamed of my identity. But one thing I do still, one of the big issues I have, here in Taiwan, I am a tour guide, and I specialize in indigenous area tourism. And one of the things that, I really try to communicate to indigenous communities is that their tourism is of great value. But a lot of times you can still feel there's a kind of inferiority complex that still exists. People are not really sure that what they have, that their culture is really as beautiful as, they may not see their culture as being that beautiful or valuable or so it's really somewhat sad. And I hope, the younger generations maybe might change that.
Mm-hmm.
As indigenous area tourism has become such is becoming more and more popular around the world, and people are really wanting to learn the traditional knowledge and traditional culture of indigenous peoples, and realize that it's such a unique, such a rich culture, such a just speaks to the very core of people. I often like to share with them, the popularity of indigenous area tourism all over the world is really, it's really taking off. And I asked them why do they think it is like that? And, oftentimes I get, well, it's something different, it's something fresh. Of course, that's true. But I say, really, a lot of people these days just feel lost. There's a lot of unhappiness, whether it be in Taiwan, the rest of the world. And I think that's due to, a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety. And I think that's due to a loss of our connection with the land, with nature. And I think whether people are aware of it or not, they seek indigenous people as a way to learn how to reconnect with nature, how to reconnect with the land. Because these people still have this knowledge. And so I said, this is so powerful and so wonderful. So yes, what you have is of great, great value, but it's sometimes you get past that inferiority complex.
Totally understand that. Yeah, it's nice to see. Well, the other day I was talking to some friends, and I guess they would identify as, basic, mainstream Taiwanese. But actually, we were in an area close by, which you probably know, here in the central region. When we're talking about the lowland indigenous peoples, a lot of the place names began with the Chinese word "se," which is like for society. And so we were like in the Sanse Sipi, circle. I think we hit them all in that car drive, and they were talking about how, in fact, that now a lot of the indigenous peoples have it pretty good because they're getting more opportunity, and they're if they're recognized tribe, there's been funds made available, so they have some better resources than maybe some 10 or 15 years back and whatnot. But yeah, there doesn't seem to be the same kind of stigma now as much as when I first came. I've been away from the U.S. for a long time. I don't know how that really relates back to Native Americans. I do have a Mohawk activist friend coming on the podcast soon, because I'd like to find out more about my culture. My grandmother was, I believe, from the Quebec Mohawk reservation, and in fact, my guest might even be a cousin. He's got the same family name as hers. Anyhow, getting back to you, we started with Hualien, and we were talking about. Then there was a group of other tribes that you said that were down in the Taidong area. Mm-hmm. And I know we covered the Amis, who are also Hualien Taidong, and any other tribal groups in Taidong.
Well, you've stopped on the Orchid Island photo.
Okay. Yes.
From my website. Orchid Island is a small island off the coast of Taiwan. It's about a 2.5 hour boat ride from Taiwan.
Have you ever done that boat ride?
Oh yes, I've done it from Taiwan and from Kending. So you can either go from Kending in the very south, from a place called Hobihu, or you can go from Taiwan, just outside of Taiwan City.
Did you do it in their traditional boats or?
No, no.
Oh, okay.
Just one of the
A
So,
ferry.
yeah, ferry. So, well, in Taiwan, ferries have to be taken a bit lightly. I have to tell anyone going on a quote unquote ferry here, they're not very luxurious. So if you're
No,
thinking about
they're pretty
ferries,
basic.
they're very basic and not all that pleasant.
Right.
So,
And if you don't like breathing diesel exhaust, you might want to
diesel
go up on the
fuel
roof.
fumes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, they are very, very basic. So just to let people know, if you're thinking like, oh, it's going to be like a really nice, cozy ferry ride, no, it's not.
No,
But
no,
it's
no,
still
no.
worth it. It's still worth it.
Right.
It's still worth
Right.
it. But just to give people some sense. But what you're seeing here are the traditional fishing boats of the official name is Yami tribe, but this tribe, a lot of people prefer to be called Dao, which means like true person. And so you'll hear both names most likely if you go there, so as not to be confused. But this is currently the only tribe in Taiwan that has been able to preserve a marine culture.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, in recent years, more and more people from this tribe have purchased modern boats with motors and things like that. So you're going to see fewer and fewer of these boats, but
Right.
Every once in a while they will build a boat, and there's a huge ceremony that goes along with launching this boat.
Don't they burn some things?
They don't. I didn't see them burn anything, but they collect a lot of taro root, which is one of the main crops on the island. There aren't a lot of crops there, but taro root is definitely one of the big ones. And so they just cover the boat in taro root. And that eventually gets distributed, as does pork.
Okay.
Basically, they bring the boat down to the shore. And before they launch it, they throw it up in the air. And the men, as they're throwing up in the air, the surrounding men are kind of in this kind of imposing pose. I don't know, you might think maybe to like the haka of the Maori.
Right.
That kind of look.
Put on their game face.
Well, just scare away any sort of bad
evil spirits.
Yeah. So before the boat gets launched, so that because going out on the sea in a small boat, boats can be anywhere from, they can hold 1 people. The largest ones hold maybe about 10. So, but going out in just a wooden boat out on the high sea was a pretty dangerous, risky thing. So
Sure.
You wanted to make sure that, there were no bad spirits coming along with you. So try to make, come back safely and with, a very good catch.
Are these people, as far as you know, are these people related to the Hawaiians at all? It seems like I recall there was like a documentary where there were like a couple of Hawaiian guys that took a traditional craft from Hawaii all the way to Taiwan. And I want to say, I thought that might have been a village in Taidong, but I don't know if there's any connection with Lanyu or not.
Well, actually, the people on all of Taiwan's indigenous peoples are considered part of the Austronesian language family, which includes the Polynesians of Hawaii. It's actually a very large language family, not by population, but by distribution. Taiwan is considered the origin of this language family. It's at the northernmost point of this language family.
Okay.
A lot of, research going on if that's really the case or not. But it makes Taiwan a very important linguistic and historic point because of that. But this language family, the northernmost point is Taiwan. The southernmost point is New Zealand. So also related to the Maori of New Zealand, and then goes all the way out to Easter Island. So also related to the peoples of the South Pacific. And then again to the west, all the way out to Madagascar. So, the indigenous peoples of Philippines, Malaysia. Okay, so it's quite a large distribution.
Yeah.
But it's thought that these people, the Yami or the Dao people, actually came to Taiwan somewhat later than the other indigenous groups in Taiwan, and that they came from the very north of the Philippines, from Bataan Island. And it was very interesting. I went once to Orchid Island when they were launching one of their traditional fishing boats, and they had invited a group over from Bataan Island. So they were trying to speak to each other in their native languages. They were trying to speak to each other in their native languages, but and they found that they could understand each other about 65-70%.
Right.
So that was very, very interesting to see that there was still a lot of overlap. And so when, people come, I even see when I'm in one community, maybe it's a Paiwan community, and then maybe some Amis visit, they'll start to ask each other, how do you call this in your language? And there is some overlap, but although they all belong to the same language family, they don't really understand each other 100% in their own languages.
Right.
So
I know, like with Edgar, Edgar, the professor down in Tainan, the music professor.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I believe his wife's family name is Juan. So he was telling me that early on in their relationship, he was so surprised to find out that some of the Shiraya words were very, very similar to Tagalog. And so there is an amount of mutual intelligibility. Of course, you can't have a complete conversation. It's not, one-to-one, but, there's definitely a relationship there.
Yeah, and it's, because I'm sure Tagalog is very influenced. There's a very large indigenous population in the Philippines, a much larger one than Taiwan has.
Right.
So I'm not surprised, but, so it's very interesting because you often hear the word mata in Taiwan. A lot of websites called mata, which means I in among many Austronesian groups. And, number 5, you'll usually hear lima. And so there are usually several words there are words that kind of carry across most groups. I won't say all, most groups.
Have you ever formally studied any of the indigenous languages, or just kind of pick up a word here and there?
Just pick up a word here or there. I often get that question of, do you speak any indigenous languages? Okay. Right. Well, there's 16 officially recognized tribes, as I said, and a lot of them have subdialects. And so where do you even start? So we mostly communicate with each other in Mandarin.
Yeah.
So that's how I communicate with them.
Sure.
Is in Mandarin.
Sure. Well, yeah, the common language. I mean, that's pretty much the case in most places. You have a common language, people learn it, they learn it in school, and you go with that. So
yeah.
And but the flip side of that, of course, is that's like the indigenous culture killer. That's why a lot of Native Americans don't speak their language, and why a lot of Taiwanese indigenous peoples don't. And for that matter, even young Taiwanese aren't really speaking Taiwanese.
Taiwanese or Hakka.
Yeah.
The Hakka language.
Right.
So no, I would love to learn. I would love to learn an indigenous language. Maybe if someday I can actually get the time and go be able to stay in somewhere for a while. I actually spent a few months in Hualien about a year and a half ago because I had wanted to do some graduate work. Mm-hmm. In anthropology in the area of indigenous studies. And so I actually enrolled in school, but kind of things, just pulled me back out of school. But my advisor, Han Chinese, but she was learning Amis, and she'd already passed the basic level test. And so I'd really wanted to go and do that as well. because I think it would be very meaningful to, I mean, I know I'll never be able to speak it fluently, but I think it would be very meaningful to be able to speak at least one language to a certain extent that you can have at least some conversation.
Right. Yeah, it would be nice.
It would be nice.
How long of it? What would you have to spend? At least like a couple of years, don't you think?
Yeah, I
And you
think
get
just
some
to be
level
able to
of
have some
fluency.
sort of small talk. Yeah.
Yeah, because
Well,
that's
that's how
kind of
long it took for Mandarin too. So.
exactly. I mean, in my mind, I felt all right. I'm gonna commit to at least 2 years because I think I need at least that, and then I'd say that's fairly accurate. I'm gonna put the Taiwan map back on again because let's see. I want to kind of get some context. We're just talking about the Austronesian network of peoples, right? So
Yes.
we're here in Taiwan. Here's the Philippines, and you said it keeps going down. So that would include Indonesia, Malaysia, all of this,
Yes.
Papua New Guinea,
Yeah.
right?
But not Australia. But not
But
Papua
not
New
Australia.
Guinea,
Okay,
but
so it
not
stops.
Australia.
So not
So we
Australia,
kind of
but
go around Australia
got to go around Australia to get to New
to New
Zealand.
Zealand.
Interesting. And you said even over as far as Zanzibar?
Easter Island.
Okay, so
Easter Island.
Wow, so that's all of these little guys out here in the middle
Yes.
of, literally the middle of nowhere.
Yes. Yes. All these very small stuff. Yes. So you'll see
Oh, and here's Hawaii.
a
Okay.
lot of similarity
Hawaii.
among them and among Taiwan's indigenous people. So because there is some relationship.
Right.
And of course there are differences because of local differences in environment, local conditions, things
Okay.
like that.
Ready for the big question? The big question.
Okay,
Ready?
sure.
Okay. Why? I mean, and this is not a question why would you stay? No, but I mean, it's a rich and vast culture and there's all kinds of, but I mean, what was it that piqued your interest? How did you end up focused on this culture and with a desire to meet and get to know these peoples more?
Well, it all started, I guess, 1997.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Before I do that, I actually came to Taiwan in 1989.
Okay.
So 31 years. Okay.
Oh, so late. I got here in 87. I had to wait 2 years for you to get here. Go ahead.
That's right. But when I first came to Taiwan, I really knew very, very little about Taiwan. And I had no idea that Taiwan had indigenous people or an indigenous culture. And I often tell people in 1989 that's maybe not so unreasonable. There wasn't the internet. There weren't cell phones.
Right.
It wasn't as easily accessible. And at that point, my son looks at me and says, "How did you live?" Okay, but that's another point, another conversation for another day. But anyway, so in 1997, I got a full-time job at the National Museum of Natural Science here in Taichung. And I was an English language guide and translator. So a lot of people, in that museum, there's a very good exhibition on Austronesian peoples, Taiwan's Austronesian peoples or indigenous peoples. So a lot of people were very interested in seeing that. So in order for me to be able to introduce that in any sort of detail, I had to understand something about it. And one of the first things I realized was there's not a lot of information available in English. So I had to kind of go through it in Chinese. As I started going through it, I became more and more interested and I started asking questions. I had several coworkers who were indigenous people. And of course there's an anthropology department. So there were several coworkers who were studying indigenous cultures. And so I would start to ask them questions. And as I asked, it just became more and more interesting. And then one of my coworkers was from the Rukai tribe. He was going home one weekend to Pingdong, southern Taiwan, to a place called Wutai. And so he asked me would I like to come. And so this is probably 1998, 1999. No one was talking about indigenous area tourism at that time. And said, yes, sure, I'd love to. So, so I remember, it was weekend, there was really no tourists there. He took me to this really beautiful waterfall, and there was nobody there. And then he was working on his master's degree at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so afterwards we went back into the community, and he speaks his native language. So he was interviewing some of the elderly women. He was researching the plants that are used in wreaths that many of the women in the community wear. These are very traditional wreaths, fresh plant materials. And so he was interviewing them about those plants and their significance. And then he would translate that into Mandarin for me to be able to understand.
Okay.
And I thought, wow, what a unique place. And you have both the ecotourism side, and then you have the cultural side. It was just, wow. I thought this was just something very, very unique that I had not seen anywhere else in Taiwan. And it just sort of piqued my interest. So I started going to other communities. I would just drive my car by myself and walk around the community. And people in Indigenous communities, they're a lot of times, you probably get this out in mainstream Taiwan, but a lot of times when people see a foreigner, they're like, they don't know, they're afraid that you can understand.
Right. So they're not quite sure how to interact with you.
Right. But a lot of people will just be like, do you speak Chinese?
So a little bit more direct, or a little bit more.
Yeah. And so, I mean, they're just going to try. And I think that's great. That's very brave. And so I said, yeah, sure, I can speak some. And so like, come over. And so I just got to meet a lot of people that way. And so over the past 22 years, I can't say I've been to every community in Taiwan, but at least more than half to. I mean, I'm sure I must have been to 300 or 400 Indigenous communities in Taiwan over the last 22 years. So, but, and a lot of people ask me, what's your favorite one? And I don't really have a favorite one.
You got to be careful, because you got friends in all of them.
I know. Well, that too, but but no, and they're all different. It's like comparing apples and oranges.
Sure.
They all have their own particular features, characteristics.
Yeah.
What makes them special. So
sure.
So I don't really have a favorite. So, but I really love spending time in the mountains. I was born and raised in LA area, California. And a lot of people think, oh, in that case, I'd probably be like a total beach goer. But actually,
you got Big Bear just right outside of LA.
We were located much closer to the mountains, actually. A very close drive to Angeles National Forest. So,
okay.
I spent a lot more time in the mountains than I did at the beach. So I think when I get into the mountains, I really feel a sense of happiness. I don't know really how to describe it. Just kind of, I'm really happy when I'm in the mountains. And so I really like being in Indigenous communities in the mountains, and really enjoying the nature and the culture. I really enjoy taking people who also have that kind of appreciation for culture and nature. I mean, when you get the right people, it is such a fun experience.
Right. So, okay. Why don't you tell us, we've got a little bit of time left. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Tribasia? We were just on that site earlier. What is Tribasia, Cheryl?
Well, Tribasia started out in 2006 as an online store, actually. After I left the Science Museum, I became a reporter, and I started as much as I could going into Indigenous communities and writing about what there is to see and do there, the people there. And I found that there were a lot of, these are glass beads, that there were a lot of workshops producing really great works. And I love them. A lot of the works I really love, so I started buying them. I didn't have any idea about doing anything at that time, I just bought them, but a lot of my foreign friends were like, oh, this is really interesting, what you're wearing, what you have in your house. And I said, well, I got it at some workshop in some indigenous community, and they're like, what are you talking about? Okay. At the same time, I heard a lot of these workshops telling me that they didn't have, it was very hard for them to survive their crafts. And so I thought, well, maybe I could kind of put these two international, buyers and indigenous workshops, indigenous-owned workshops together. And so I built this website, Tribasia, as an online store to promote Taiwan's indigenous handicrafts overseas. I don't work on that side so much anymore because now I do a lot more tourism, but I hope by that bringing people into the communities and they can directly buy products from the artists and artisans there. I think is, so yeah, there's some tour information. So now I focus mostly on tailor-made tours for small groups into indigenous communities.
So when you say a small group, you're talking about approximately how many people?
It could be one person. Often it's a couple. Could be a family, maybe 3-4 people.
But not a big tour bus.
Not a big tour bus. We usually use a van or a car. So because we can do that, so few people, we can go into indigenous communities and stay there, be in depth. I really try to encourage interactions with the people in indigenous communities, so that there can be an exchange, people can learn from each other. But we can also, because there aren't a lot of big hotels or in indigenous communities, you stay in guest houses, homestays. But because our groups are small, we can stay there. So we can stay there, we can eat there, we can interact with the people there. We can go hiking in the local historical trails. We can go play in the river, play in the water, eat the local food and just shop in the community-owned workshops.
Speaking of local food, do you have any favorite dish or two that you want to mention?
Well, I always like to tell people that a lot of Taiwan's food you can now get in many countries all over the world. But one that's very hard to find is indigenous food.
Right.
It's really authentic in the sense that before there was refrigeration, a lot of things relied on being smoked or fermented, pickled, basically, including raw meat. So it's kind of a taste that you have to get used to. So a lot of the indigenous food is somewhat modified to modern tastes. So I really like some of the traditional spices like magao, which is mountain peppercorn. It's kind of a lemon plus.
Oh, I've had that. I love that.
Yeah, it's awesome,
okay.
right? And so,
yeah.
And you get, grilled pork, grilled fish. This fish you see here is
I want to say I got that pepper. I want to say like by Nanzhuang. So then maybe that's maybe the Atayal are using that.
The Atayal used it mostly.
Okay.
Now it's being used by most indigenous groups in indigenous cuisine. And there's another one that's called Tana in indigenous language. I think it's also Atayal, but it's Cicong. It's from a tree that the trunk has these kind of
stickers, spikes.
Yeah, spikes, yeah. And so use the leaves, and those leaves are actually very nice spice as well. But you'll find, things like grilled fish, grilled meat, wild greens. So the Amis have very great traditional knowledge about the use of wild greens.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Like the fiddlehead ferns and stuff. That's one of the things I really like about like going to Hualien. I mean, I always look forward to like the mountain vegetable, the mountain varietals of all these different vegetables and like things that but now they have like mini ones or sour ones and all these different colors and shapes and
and edible ferns. I mean, I think that's a lot of people probably haven't had a chance to eat ferns, but they're quite edible ferns here in Taiwan.
Yeah, the fiddleheads for sure.
Bird's nest fern. Yeah, I love bird's nest fern quite a lot. So, yeah. So
do you know? Go on. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's quite different, but I think people find it quite tasty.
Do you know if they have anything approaching something like sumac? I mean, any kind of a bark that they maybe make into a powder as a seasoning? Do they have anything like that you know of?
I've not seen that. No, I've not seen that. I know that bark from a paper mulberry tree was used to make clothing.
Okay,
Um,
that makes
yes,
sense.
but I've not seen it used in food. It might have been, but I've not
Right.
seen it.
Well, the
Not seen
common
it.
ones, you know, that we use are like cinnamon, which is, you know, from bark, and then like sumac,
Right.
which is more the Middle East, and that also comes from the bark of a tree. So, okay. Well, what is I see like Sun Moon Lake. So you have a
Yeah, because some of these are just examples of what people can do. As I said,
right,
all are tailor-made, but try to give people an idea, because when people come to Taiwan, especially for the first time, they do want to see some of the more famous sites like
right,
Tohu Gorge and Sun Moon Lake, and I realize
right.
that. And so, but they also want to see something that's more in-depth, something off the beaten path.
More exotic.
Yeah, maybe exotic, but off the beaten path anyway.
Right.
And so try to combine those so that they can get the best of both worlds when they're here. So it's a very pretty drive, actually, going from Alishan in southern Taiwan, the high mountains there, which is a Zhou area, and then driving through Nantou, through Bunong area, and then you get into the Samun Lake, which is the Sao tribe, right? So so it's a very pretty drive. You go through parts of the Alishan National Scenic Area, and you go through parts of Yushan National Park. Yushan means Jade Mountain. That's the highest mountain in Taiwan. And so it's a very nice drive, and you get kind of a very good diversity of things to see and do, such as tea, different tribes, culture of different tribes. So it's kind of a good trip. Yeah, if there's any more time left, my most popular one is actually going up to Hsinchu area, which is in northern Taiwan, and
This one, the 3-day Hsinchu Mountain.
3-day one, yeah. So you get a bit of hiking. So that's a Tile, Indigenous Tile tribe. So we start out in Wufeng Township in Hsinchu, and we hike this trail called Stone Eco Trail. It's not very long, only about 1.5 kilometers, but there's quite a few interesting stories that can be told here. And there's also a natural hot springs area right where you see the river there. And then the main attraction is Simakusi, which is a very interesting community in that everyone is involved in tourism, and all of the funds are distributed to everyone in the community. Have a really beautiful trail there that goes to an area of what are called sacred trees. In Taiwan, sacred means old trees. And so that's quite a nice trail to do. So that's a pretty popular one.
Well, Cheryl, let me ask you this, because our time is almost up. What is your preferred means of communicating with your tourists or potential tourists? So if people want to get in touch with you and find out more about your tours or what you're doing, is email best, or is Twitter best, or what?
Well, I'm on Twitter, Tribasia Tours on Instagram.
Right. I'll go ahead and put that all on the link. So you're on Twitter, so we have
so I do have a email. So
you'll give me that. I'll put that in the link so people can access that.
Yeah.
Okay. And there's also, if they go to your website, so it's tribe-asia.com. You probably have your contact info here as well, correct? Okay.
Yes. Yeah, and links to my Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.
Okay. Good. Well, listen, it's been so wonderful having you on. I mean, it's been educational for me. There's a lot of things you talked about. I knew a little tidbit here, a little tidbit there, but now I'm getting a little bit more breadcrumbs. And so hopefully someday I'll find out even more, and maybe even hook up with one of your tours and do it right. So,
that'd be great.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah. Welcome to A.Connector, and keep on connecting with all of the good people of Taiwan and around the world.
Great.
All right.